In this video, we're going to practice implementing a function and then also calling that function from a main program. In this example, we'll be looking at ISBN numbers. Those are the unique numbers that are assigned to books, and you typically see them on the back of a book or on an online listing. You can also use them in libraries to easily locate sources. The digits in ISBN numbers have specific meanings, so we might want to write a program to validate an ISBN number. Let's write a function that checks to see if an ISBN number has the correct number of digits in it. Let's assume that every ISBN number is 13 digits, and we'd like to write a function that returns true whenever the ISBN number has that correct number of digits and false in other cases. Before we start writing the code, let's plan out our solution by creating an APR chart. Remember, that has a column that represents the arguments or input into the function, a column that represents the processing steps for the algorithm, and a column that represents the return value that comes out of the function. If we're writing this function that validates a ISBN number's length, the input to the function is the ISBN number itself. The information that comes out of the function is the Boolean result, either the true or false value. And then in the processing step, we want to determine whether the ISBN number has the correct length. So we'll want to check the length of the ISBN number. If the length is 13, then we'll want to return true. And in all other cases, we'll return false. Let's now write our function implementation, and let's call our function validate ISBN length. If we're writing the function implementation, we have to start with the reserved word def for define, and then we have to provide the name or identifier of our function. We're calling our function validate ISBN length. And inside the parentheses, we have to provide a parameter name, a placeholder name to use for the information that comes in. In this case, the information that's being passed into the function is the ISBN number. Inside the function body, indented, we'll have to include all of the individual processing steps. In this case, I'm going to create a variable that says that initially we'll assume that the check, it gives a false result. Then we can check to see if the length of the ISBN number is equal to 13. If it is, then I want to change the value of check so it's true, because that represents a good length for the ISBN number. And then no matter what, at the end, I want to return the value of check. So again, when the program calls this function, it'll initialize the variable check to be false. If I find out that the length of the ISBN number is valid, then I'll change the value of check to be true. And no matter what, I'll return the value of check at the end of the function. Let's write another function for ISBN checking. Suppose we know that every ISBN number that's 13 digits starts with the 3-digit code 978. If my ISBN number starts with any other 3 digits, it can't possibly be valid. And suppose we want to write a function that returns true if the ISBN number has the correct prefix digits and returns false in the other cases. Let's create an APR chart for this function. Just like in our last example, the arguments expected by this function include the ISBN number. The return value is also going to be a Boolean that represents whether the ISBN is valid or not based on the prefix. In the processing step, first we're going to need to compare the first 3 digits of the ISBN to the string 978. If they are the same, then we should return true. Otherwise, we should return false. Let's now implement all of our steps in the test ISBN prefix function. Whenever we're doing the function implementation, we need to start with the reserved word def, then include the name of the function, in this case that's test ISBN prefix, and then use the information from our APR chart to determine what information should we use as a parameter. In this case, we want to use the ISBN number as the input from outside the function. Inside the ISBN prefix function, we want to include implementation for all of the steps in our processing column. First thing we are going to do is create a prefix variable that stores the first 3 values from the ISBN number. So I'm going to take a slice of the ISBN number starting at index 0, and I want to finish at index 3. That's because I want to include index 0, 1, and 2, the first 3 characters in the ISBN string. Then I'm also going to create a variable called valid and initialize that to be false. And then if I test the prefix value and find that it is equal to 978, then I want to update the value of the variable valid so it's true. And no matter what, I want to return valid. So that will return either the true or the false value, depending on what the prefix is. Now suppose that we want to write our main program that asks the user to enter an ISBN number, and then we want to call the test ISBN prefix function to determine if the prefix is valid, and also check the length of the number. Let's print out a message saying that the prefix is valid or invalid in our code. So as input, we're going to prompt the user to enter an ISBN number. That belongs in the input column because the user will enter that information. In the output column, actually it says we just have to validate the ISBN prefix here. So we'll output a message saying valid ISBN prefix or invalid ISBN prefix. In my processing column, I'll want to welcome the user to the program. I'll need to prompt the user to enter a ISBN number. Then I'll need to call my test ISBN prefix function to determine if the prefix is valid or not. And I know that my test ISBN prefix function returns a value, so I'll need to save that return value in my main program. Finally, I'll test the return value, and if it was true, then I'm going to print the valid message. Otherwise, I'll print invalid. Let's translate this plan into our main program. I'm going to begin writing the main program in Python. Let me open idle and I'll open a new file. The last time we wrote a Python program that included a function that we defined and implemented, we wrote the function first and then the main program. Whenever you're writing a program, you can actually do the steps in either order. If you prefer to write the main program first and then fill in the function information later, that's completely fine. Remember that our program always starts out with header information. Then we should import any library functions needed. In this case, we don't have any. The next thing that we'll include is our function definition. And then finally, I'll include the statements for my main program, including the step to call the function. Let's look at the steps that should be included in our main program. First step says we should welcome the user. Step number 2 says prompt the user to enter an ISBN number. And we want to store this as a string. Next, we want to call the ISBN prefix function and save the return value. Now, we haven't written the function yet, but from writing our APR chart earlier, that the function is going to take one argument and that it does have a return value that's a Boolean variable. We know we need to save the return value. We know the name of the function. It's called test ISBN prefix. And we know that we're expecting the ISBN number as a argument. And then the final step in the program is that if the result is true, then I want to print out the ISBN is valid. And otherwise, I want to print out the ISBN is invalid. Let's stop and test out just that much of the program. When we run the program, say we enter a 13-digit number. Python tells us the test ISBN prefix function is not defined. See that message? That's because we don't have the function definition for test ISBN prefix finished. If we want to test our program so far, we'll need to comment that particular line in the program and instead maybe assign result a fixed value that's not dependent on the user input. We're just testing to make sure that everything kind of makes sense so far in our program on a basic level. So it prints out that the ISBN number is valid. That's because we've set result to always be true. It's not really checking anything about the number at all, but you're able to see that it is in fact letting you read in the data and that you're printing the proper message. You can also check out what would happen if you set the result to be false. Again, it's not actually testing the ISBN number in this case. No matter what you enter, it will say that it's invalid. That's because we set the result to be false. And that's just a little tip that you can use to test your own programs. If you don't have something like a function definition written early on, you can just assume that the return value has a particular piece of data stored in it and then use that to test the rest of your program. Now that we have our main program implemented, let's implement the test ISBN prefix function. We're going to include the reserved word def and then the name of the function, test ISBN prefix. We want to indicate the identifier that we want to use as our parameter or placeholder inside the algorithm. I'm going to call it ISBN. Then inside the function, the first thing we want to do is create the prefix string. I'm going to take a slice from index 0 through 2. So I put 0, 3 in here because 3 is one bigger than the index that I want to capture. Now I'm going to create a variable called valid and initialize it to be false. If the prefix that I collect is equal to 978, then I want to set valid equal to true. And no matter what, I want to return the value valid. Looks like we have a good implementation here. Let's test out our program. When I entered a ISBN number that started with 123, it tells me invalid, and that's correct. The ISBN number that I entered does not start with 978 like it's required to. Let's try it with a number that does start with 978. When we enter something that does start with 978, it tells me it's valid. Let's try it with a few more numbers. What if we have something that starts with a 9 but doesn't start with 978? Can we trick the computer? No. The computer knows that 956 is not the same as 978, and so it returns invalid in that case. So far, it looks like our ISBN checker is in great shape. Suppose we wanted to add in the code for the length checker that we wrote. We can put as many functions as we want up at the top. For each of them, we'll start with a separate def statement. And in my length checker, let me see what that was called. Validate ISBN length. And remember when we wrote the APR chart for that, we said that also takes one parameter that represents the ISBN number. Cool. Now we want to implement all the steps that are in there. In this one, we set a check variable equal to false. Then we tested if the len of ISBN was equal to 13. Then we updated the value of check so it was true because we had a valid length. And then no matter what, we return the value of check. See what happens when we run our program now. We entered a short number, but look, it still says it's valid. Why is that? Well, it's because we implemented the check to validate the ISBN length, but in our main program, did we ever call that function into action? No. In our main program, we have a print statement welcoming the user. We collect the input of the ISBN number. We tested the prefix and responded to the result, but we never did anything with the length. Let's call the validate length function here. I'm going to make a result2 variable, and then I want to call my validate ISBN length function and pass in the ISBN number as the argument. And then down here, suppose I want to test to see if result is true and result2 is true. That means it's valid on both cases. And then if only one or the other or neither is valid, then we'll print the ISBN number is invalid message. Let's test that out. So suppose we enter that short number again. It has the right prefix, but it's not the right length. So now it tells us that's invalid because it's checking the length. Let's try it again with a longer ISBN. 1, 2, 3. 13 digits. And that one says it is valid. That's because it's both the right length and it has the right prefix. Let's try one that has the right length but the wrong prefix. Again, it tells us that's invalid. It's the right length but not the right prefix. Looks like our code is doing pretty well. We'd probably want to run our code with some additional test cases. Think about what additional test cases you would include. At this point, you should know how to import a function written in an external file, know the syntax for creating your own named function, know where to include the function in your Python code, and you'll be familiar with the syntax for making function calls in Python.